Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Justin Kohler, and I'm with Risk Management Professionals. And today we will be going over the State Accidental Release Program, Risk Management Program, Project Safety Management Program, Common Deficiencies. The producer is Oscar Hernandez, and if you have any questions, please feel free to send us a message, and we'll go ahead and get started. So our key services are listed as follows for reference for later. If you have any needs, feel free to reach out to us and we'll do the best to address them. And if you don't see the needs currently on this slide, please reach out to us anyway. And we do a lot of work that's outside of the box, so we'll work with you to address your needs as necessary. The topics that we will be covering today include Program 3 element overlap, periodic requirements, common program deficiencies, common mechanical integrity requirements and deficiencies, and regulatory updates. So this slide shows the requirements from two of the federal government regulatory facilities and the state regulatory. So you can see that there's a lot of overlap between the federal and state requirements, and the only differences you could see in like OSHA and CalOSHA, but pretty much they're all the same. And again, this is for Program 3 elements, so it's going to encompass your Program 2 and Program 1 elements, and it's a little more broad of an explanation. So for periodic requirements, it's necessary for any ongoing changes to your process that occur for you to update as quickly as possible. And for your annual update, you're going to want to look at operating procedures, emergency plan. For triennial, you're going to want to look at refresher training and compliance audit. And every 5 years, you'll want to look at your CalARP RMP Submittal, hazard assessment, which is your offsite consequence analysis, process hazard analysis, and if you're in California, your seismic assessment. So for the remainder of this presentation, the common deficiencies will be covered as observed by industry, consultants, and regulators, and will include the EPA enforcement alert, June 2019, and the revised CalARP regulation effective November 17, 2017. For the CalARP RMP submittal, the common deficiencies that occur especially are that the submittal is not completed and submitted to the agency in a timely manner. This results in fines for facilities and can be avoided if it's being kept track of. So you always want to know when your anniversary date is for your CalARP submittal and stay on top of it to prevent fines for going over the deadline. The management system has to be described in the CalARP submittal, so it's important to stay organized and make sure that everything is up to date for who's responsible for what as a part of the procedures and process is concerned. Any changes in ownership or updated contact information needs to be kept on file. And this isn't going to reset your 5-year anniversary date. So just make sure that this information is quick and easy to get a hold of. It's well organized because this is the information that we're going to ask you for. And especially if you're approaching a deadline, any delays could impact the facility and incur fines. Also, things to keep in mind, any new accident history or emergency contact information changes. So just make sure, even if it's a near miss and you didn't actually have an outbreak of containment, you still want to address that. You still want to make sure that that's recorded, so that way when your next hazard assessment or PHA come up, that these things can be addressed. So going into hazard assessment, for the alternative release case scenario, it's going to be your more likely to occur rather than your worst case scenario, whereas your worst case scenario is the absolutely worst case that can happen. So if all of the chemicals spilled into the atmosphere, into the environment, what would be the most devastating consequences? So you're going to want to look at the guidelines for your alternative case and your worst case scenario, which are covered in CalARP section 2750.3 and .4. And you want to make sure that you're abiding by these guidelines so that your hazard assessment is performed correctly. For revalidation, failure to update population count based on the most recent census and failure to update the list of sensitive receptors and maps were required for, especially for LEPC Region 1 in California. These are common deficiencies that we see and can result in, again, fines for not meeting regulatory standards. Right now, we're using the 2010 census data, and it'll be changing soon in 2020. So again, this information has to be updated as soon as possible. And so for process safety information, the key information to keep track of is your piping and instrument diagrams. If they're missing or if they do not reflect changes to the process, it can make your PHA really difficult. So typically we have to prepare for your PHA, and we're going through pre-causing each node what can go wrong, and if the P&IDs aren't correct, then it's going to affect the session, and we're going to have to redo either the whole session, depending on how dramatic the changes are, or just it's going to set back the certification process. So it's really important to make sure that your P&IDs are up to date, even if it's just right before your PHA that you go ahead and update your P&IDs. It's important that whoever is running the PHA has the most current P&IDs. Otherwise, your system isn't going to be properly addressed for safety concerns. So also for process safety information, typical things that are missing that we find are the relief system design, the non-compliance with RAGAGEP, which is recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices, electrical area classifications and distribution system, chemical reactivity hazards, and codes and standards used in the design. So all this information has to be accounted for your process safety information. Moving on to process hazard analysis. So for your PHA, it's important that your, knowledgeable people are attending these meetings so that the most accurate description of how the system works, how it functions, and what things are likely to occur, the severity, likelihood, and risk that are associated with outbreak are all addressed appropriately. So it's important to have operators, engineers, and any managers, anyone that is knowledgeable on the process at this meeting. So that way, the most accurate information is obtained to reduce risk and to make sure that your facility is protected. So furthermore, when identifying the hazards properly, you want to include the understanding of the gap between the new industry codes and codes to which the facility was built. So there's been a lot of restrictions and codes that have been enforced more lately over the past couple of decades than previously. So we see a lot of problems with older facilities not updating their equipment or abiding by the codes that are now set. And it can be costly in the long run to do this. At first, it's an investment, but later on it can cause problems with regulatory problems and safety issues. So you wanted to be able to develop a plan to address these deficiencies and make any upgrades as necessary, and it'll be worth it in the long run. A few key things to look out for are your emergency shut-off location. You want it easily accessible, and you want to make sure that your employees are trained and know how to respond during an emergency. You want to make sure that any controls from old industry standards aren't missing, and you want to make sure that your pressure relief devices are located in an area where they're not going to spray down employees, people, personnel. You want to make sure that it's in a safe area. Furthermore, for your PHA, it's important that your recommendations are closed in a timely manner. You typically want to close your PHA recommendations within 2.5 years or before, or during the next turnaround. The sooner the better. And make sure that you keep documentation on everything, that all the recommendations that have been opened and that have been closed, and include the what it was and the dates and how it was implemented. You must keep this information for the lifetime of the process. So just stay organized is the best advice I can give you. And for your 5-year update, you have to make sure that otherwise you're going to face fines. You want to make sure that you're you don't fall short of your anniversary date. Your PHA has to be done every 5 years, so just keep that in mind. And for revalidations performed more than once consecutively, you're not supposed to perform revalidations more than once, so you want to make sure that if you do perform a revalidation, that you're able to wait until the next revalidation, or until the anniversary for your next revalidation. Your facility siting not based on current designs, codes, and standards. Your industry accepted approach not used or not used correctly, and inconsistent considerations of scenarios and risk ranking. So just keep in mind, as long as you have knowledgeable personnel on the topic of your PHA, then you should be able to be good. Make sure that you're abiding by industry standards and the codes and the CalARP, and that should take care of it. So for your operating procedures, common deficiencies that we find are that they are outdated or not reviewed annually, that written procedures are not synchronized with the operator action, each phase of operation, even if it's temporary, isn't listed, emergency shutdown procedure job assignments aren't clear, acceptable alarm set point ranges are not documented, procedures are not in the language of the user, consequences or deviations not included, and safe work practices not followed. So it's important to abide by your operating procedures these things are created for outlining how your system runs, and you want to make sure that your operators are following these procedures and you're not deviating from the procedures to make sure that your process goes as safely as possible. For training, you want to make sure that everyone in the facility is well trained, and you could do this by making sure by quizzing them, whether oral or written or field observation. You need to make sure that they have a good understanding about the process and procedures. The training should cover all responsibility of personnel on site that operate the system, and should be in the language of the operator and users. Moving on to mechanical integrity. RIM procedures not available or not complete, inspection, maintenance not performed or not documented, frequency not consistent with industry standards, pipe corrosion issues and piping support security not addressed, schedule and procedure for defrosting, ice buildup non-existent, equipment deficiencies not corrected in a safe or timely manner. These are just a list of common deficiencies we see with mechanical integrity and should be thought of throughout your validation process. Furthermore, not documenting preventative maintenance schedule with the contractor, quality assurance plan not in place, sufficient information not available for piping and instrument diagrams to understand hazards and develop maintenance procedures, and facility does not have an adequate ventilation. Moving on to management of change, the following is required for any time there's a change in management. If the procedure is not used, the prevention program documentation not updated to reflect changes, personnel not adequately notified of the change, and the need for modifications to exist, operating and or maintenance procedures, or whether new procedures are needed is not assessed. MOC procedures not completed prior to startup. So anytime that there is a change in your personnel, in your management of your operations, your process, everything needs to be documented and kept organized. For pre-startup safety review, the procedure needs to be documented for how your facility does your startup and how you make sure that your startup is going to happen safely. Your documentation not kept in file or completely following implementation, documentation not completed or signed prior to startup, and PSSR not documented and conducted independently of MOC. So you want to make sure that your pre-startup safety review is clear and organized and followed in industry. Moving on. For compliance audits, recommendations are not correctly implemented are as follows. The agreed upon timeline for AA due 1.5 years for audit. During next planned turnaround, compliance audit not completed by the anniversary date. No documentation included regarding audit scope, methods used or findings. Program implementation not verified with facility personnel, and completion dates of recommendations not included in documentation. Not keeping most recent 2 audits on file. For incident investigation, no follow-through or recommendations. The agreement on the timeline of the AA due 1.5 years following investigation or due 2 years after the date of the incident, whichever is earlier, and during next planned turnaround. Findings not shared with affected personnel. Investigation not initiated within 48 hours of the incident. Required information not documented during investigation or in report. No investigation or documentation of near misses. Completion dates not documented for the recommendation / deficiency. It's really important for you to document near misses, because if the incident could have happened a little bit different, it could have been a full miss, and you could have had a hazard. For employee participation, it's important that your employees are well trained and well documented, so that you have a list of everyone at your facility, and your personnel involved with the process operations must be aware of the location of the CalARP RMP PSM documentation and procedures. Personnel not involved with the program development, documentation not in the language of the operator or user. So again, these are just common deficiencies that we see. And if you have any questions, just let us know. So for hot work permit, the most common problems that we see are personnel not trained or knowledgeable on the procedures, records are not documented or not kept on file, hot work area is not field verified by a supervisor. For contractors, no documentation regarding contractors' training or procedures for conducting work maintenance on the covered process, lack of contractor visitor safety training, and lack of periodic evaluation of contractors. For emergency planning and response, not knowing the difference between emergency planning and response, not having the correct plan in place, and not meeting emergency response requirements by other agencies are common deficiencies. You want to make sure your contact information is up to date and that your annual review has all of the completed documents, and that training is performed so your employees know how to respond in case of an emergency, and in case you're relying on community efforts for the emergency, you want to make sure that those relationships are well established and that a good line of communication is executed. Furthermore, coordination with the local agencies must be documented. The written response procedures include the informing and interfacing with the public and local responders, documentation of proper first aid and emergency medical equipment, procedures related to chemical release, checking, inspecting emergency equipment, ICS training for relevant employees. And for follow-up, assign an individual to follow up on recommendation completion. This is important so that way if any changes for recommendation are made, that you have somebody key responsible for updating this. Assign anticipated date of completion to every recommendation. Follow regulatory requirements, verify AA or UPA agrees with timeline. Document action taken to address recommendation label as closed when addressed, the record of the date of completion. So for common deficiencies, written procedures must be available and complete or implemented. Inspection maintenance must be performed and documented. Frequency is not consistent with industry standards, pipe corrosion issues, piping support security not addressed, and schedule and procedure for defrosting. Equipment deficiencies not corrected in a safe or timely manner. And furthermore, not documenting preventative maintenance schedule with contractor, quality assurance plan not in place, sufficient information not available for piping and equipment to understand hazards and develop maintenance program, or facility does not have adequate ventilation. So I know we covered a lot today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us and we will do our best to answer your questions. And yeah, I think that that's all for today. Oscar, is there any questions?
Let me take a quick look. Yeah, here's one. It says, how long should they keep the documentation?
You should keep all of your documentation for the lifetime of the process.
Here's another question. Here's a question by Thelma Sass. It says, what is the QA plan?
I'm not totally sure what's being referred to, but I will get back to you on that. I'll follow up with you.
And then here's a question by Chad. The 2.5 years timeline, is that for California only?
No. The 2.5-year timeline is for everywhere.
Oh, Thelma Sass says he's speaking about the quality assurance plan.
And what was the original question for?
He said, what is the quality assurance plan?
The quality assurance plan, I'll have to get back to you on that, but I'll look into it and I'll contact you.
And I believe that's all the questions for today.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.